This is Dr. Lindsay, and what I'd like to talk about now is gross domestic product, which is abbreviated as GDP. And GDP is the market value, or the money value, of all the final goods and services that are produced within a country in some time period. And what we're doing is adding everything up and getting some value. So let's take the example again here of an economy that only produces two things. And this will be the PPF, production possibility frontier, for that economy that only produces two things and doesn't trade with any other countries and has no government. And we'll say they produce nothing but apples and oranges. So over here will be apples and down here on the horizontal axis will be oranges. And let's say that in 2013 they produce 10 million apples and 20 million oranges. And that will be representative, we'll say, by this point on the PPF, which corresponds to 20 million or 10 million apples and 20 million oranges. Now we don't want to describe their GDP as, well, 10 million apples and 20 million oranges, because if they had a lot of products, that would be difficult to list them all in the quantities. What we want to do is be able to put a monetary value on it. So let's say that the price of apples are 50 cents a piece in this economy, and oranges happen to be $1 a piece in this economy. Well, the way we do it is we literally add up apples and oranges. So the value of all the apples that are produced are 10 million times 50 cents, price times quantity, and that would be $5 million worth of apples. And the amount of oranges that are produced are 20 million times $1, so that would be $20 million worth of oranges. And we just add up literally apples and oranges, and we say that the monetary value of the GDP in this economy is $25 million. And if there were more things in this economy that would produce, say, cars or haircuts, doctor's visits, services, all we would do is add up all the quantity of cars, multiply them by the price of the cars, and just keep adding them on to this number here. So now remember that GDP is the monetary value, the market value of all the final goods and services produced within the country in some time period. So we only count final goods. We'll underline this one. So in other words, we would count all the cars that are made in the country, but we wouldn't count the tires that would go into those new cars. So if Ford builds a bunch of new cars, we would calculate the number of cars times the price of them sold and the GDP, but we wouldn't count the tires or the engines that Ford buys that go into these. Otherwise, we would be counting things twice or three times. We'd have this double counting problem. So we don't want to include the intermediate goods, only the final goods that are being finished and sold. Now these are also goods that are produced in some time period. And that means usually it's a year or a quarter, 3-month period. and it doesn't matter if they're sold or not. What this means is if Ford was to build a car in 1965, say Ford Mustang, that is included in the GDP of 1965, but if someone keeps it, drives it around for 20 years, and sells it again in 1985, that sale in 1985 is not included in GDP in 1985. Only it's included in the GDP in the year that it was actually produced. Next, we only produce goods that are sold or produced within a country. So as far as cars go, the cars that Ford makes that are produced inside the United States would count as part of United States GDP. But the cars made by Ford in China would not count as part of U.S. GDP. They would count as far as part of China's GDP. And the same thing, Honda, if they make cars over here in the United States, they would count as the GDP in the United States. So any cars that say were made here in the U.S., but then they're exported to another country, would count as GDP for this country. Sometimes you will hear of gross national product. And economists used to talk about this quite a bit. And gross national product is product that is made by U.S. companies, and it doesn't matter where it's made. So the cars that Ford makes over in China would be included in gross national product, but the cars made in the United States by Honda would not be included in gross national product. So it's just the products made by the U.S. Companies, whether it's here or abroad. As opposed to GDP, where it doesn't matter the company, the nationality that's making them, it only matters where they're made as far as GDP goes. Now, GDP does not include several things. For one thing, it does not include illegal goods. And it's very difficult to measure and quantify illegal goods since they're not reported anywhere. It does not include the underground economy. Underground, and that has somewhat of a sinister name. It's not as sinister as it sounds. This is the cash barter economy that doesn't get reported to the IRS. So if someone comes over to your house and offers you to paint your house for $1,000 cash, and you give him the cash, and he doesn't report it to the U.S. Internal Revenue Service, that would be included as part of the underground economy. And in this country, people are fairly honest about paying their taxes, so the amount is estimated for the underground economy somewhere around 8 or 12%, somewhere in that range. In other countries, especially poor, undeveloped countries, it can be considerably more. In Bolivia, the underground economy accounts for about 2/3 of their economy. It's a very poor country, landlocked country in South America. GDP also does not include work you do for yourself. So in other words, someone comes over and paints your house for $1,000. You pay him, he reports it to the IRS. That is included in GDP, $1,000 worth. But if you go out and do it yourself, your labor is not included. Just the paint you buy would be included in GDP, but none of your labor. It also does not include leisure time, because it doesn't have a specific monetary value money that you're earning. Now, are these things important? Important? Well, yes, you should know what they are. Yes, they're important for a test, but probably not terribly important as long as they're consistent from year to year. Because what we really want to know with GDP is how it's changing from year to year. And as long as the percentage of the underground economy is roughly the same, and illegal goods is the same, then if we're just looking at the change from year to year, it's not really going to make any difference. It's only going to make a difference when we look at economy over a long period of time, or if we're comparing countries' GDP, then we have to keep these things in mind. GDP is reported at an annual rate every quarter. So if the fourth quarter GDP for this year is 2.8%, then what they mean is if the economy was to continue at that same pace for a year, that it would increase by 2.8%. It doesn't mean that the economy went up by 2.8% in that quarter. It actually means that it went up only 1/4 of that amount. The numbers that are reported as either seasonally adjusted or not seasonally adjusted. It'll be written as SA or NSA. So seasonally adjusted or not seasonally adjusted. And the reason for this is that there is some seasonal component of GDP. The economy tends to go up a little bit and down a little bit at certain times of the year. For example, Christmas time, there's a lot of people buying products around Christmas time and special hiring just for Christmas. They hire more Santa Clauses for the malls, and then they lay them off at the end of Christmas and send Santa Claus back to the North Pole or to the unemployment line. Summertime, there also tends to be a lot of hiring for different things that are going on just for the summer, and then people are laid off at the end of the summer, and the people that collect this data know that happens, and so they take the data for GDP and they make slight adjustments to it to compensate for that. Now the next question is GDP some measure of well-being? Some people say no. Some people say yes. And the reason why it may not be a great measure of well-being is it does leave out certain things. For example, it leaves out leisure. And we would all be better off having more leisure time. But there's no accounting for that extra leisure time in the GDP. And it leaves out services at the home. So, leaves out services at home. The things you do at home that don't get included in GDP. And it puts in some things that aren't necessarily good, but maybe bad. So it puts in some things such as maybe damage to the environment. So if there's, say, a big oil spill and it costs quite a bit of money and time to clean it up, that would be included in GDP, even though clearly it's not something that's good for the country. Some books will say that GDP is not a measure of the a nation's economic well-being. I disagree with that. I think that it is a measure of the nation's economic well-being. It's not a perfect measure. There's problems with it, but I think in general it's the best measure we have, and I think that it does go up and down with the well-being of the country. There have been some studies showing that GDP and in countries and a country's well-being, as reported by the people living in that country, are positively correlated. And certainly if the GDP is high in a country, it reduces the chance of working for $3 a day as a rice farmer, and it reduces the chance of an elderly person going through the trash at midnight looking for cans to recycle, reduces the chance of young pretty girls trying to sell themselves for $12 to anybody at night just to make an extra money to eat and put some food in their motor scooter, and reduces the chances of dying because you don't have any money to go to the hospital when you're sick. So why do we want to measure GDP anyway? Why measure Well, a couple of reasons. One reason is we want to be able to make comparisons between countries. We want to know how to compare the income of the United States versus the income in Uruguay. And we can look at that by looking at GDP. Now here's when, in trying to make comparisons between countries, now we have to remember the problems there is in measuring GDP and with things like the underground economy. The second reason for measuring GDP is we want to measure the change. So we want to measure the change in GDP. And this is the most important reason. We'll put a star here against that one. We want to know, is GDP going up? Going up? Is GDP going down? And if it is, by how much? Because we want to know if the economy is expanding or contracting. And how fast is it expanding or contracting? Now, one of the biggest problems with GDP numbers is with inflation. Inflation causes a lot of problems in trying to measure GDP. And inflation is, I'll abbreviate it with pi, but it's just the general increase in prices in the economy. Deflation is the opposite, a general decrease in prices in the economy. Now GDP, remember, is measured in monetary terms about what is produced. So it's a real problem if prices change. If prices are not consistent, then the GDP numbers are not consistent. Remember, we calculated GDP for that small country by adding up apples and oranges, and we multiply the quantity of oranges by times the price of oranges, the quantity of apples times the price of apples. Well, what happens if the price of apples change and the price of oranges change? It throws a whole wrench into it. So economists have two definitions of GDP. There's nominal GDP, which is what we calculated before. It's just the dollar amount of GDP when we multiply prices times quantities. So this is just the prices times the quantities. And the other type is real GDP. And real GDP is really what we want to know. It's the dollar amount after adjusting. So adjusting for changes to the prices. For changes in prices. And nominal GDP is measured in what's called current dollars. CURR. Current dollars. Put that in quotes. This is what it's measured in. And real GDP is measured in what's called constant dollars. So let's take an example of how to calculate GDP. And let's say we have a small country that only makes one product. We'll say pizzas. And they don't trade with any other products in any other countries. And there's no government. And this is all they do, is just make pizzas. And we'll say in 2011, they were able to make 1,000 pizzas. And the price of those pizzas, we'll say, was $10. Well, their GDP for 2011 would be 1,000 times $10, or $10,000. And this is the nominal GDP. It's just the quantities times the prices, times the current prices of 2011. And in 2012, say 2012, they're able to make 1,500 pizzas. So the amount that they can make goes up. The GDP goes up. And we'll say in 2013, they have a little downturn for whatever reason, and they can only make 1,350 pizzas. But then in 2014, they're able to resume their upward path, and in 2014, they're able to make 2,000 pizzas. Now let's say the price doesn't stay at $10. It's $10 in 2011, but there's some inflation. The price of pizzas go up. And we'll say that in 2012, the price of pizzas is now $11. And in 2013, it goes up again, we'll say $15. Inflation. 2014, pizzas are now $20. More inflation. Inflation every year. So if we were to calculate the GDP in each year, we'll say 2012, well, it's 1,500 pizzas times $11, which is $16,500 GDP, nominal dollars. 2013, it's $1,350 times $15, which comes out to be $20,250. And 2014, 2,000 pizzas times $20 comes out to be $40,000. So you can see that real GDP, the amount they actually produce, continues up, except for that 1 year in 2013, which it goes down. But if we look at GDP in nominal dollars, that increases every year, from 10,000 to 16 to 20, then 40. And the problem with that is that it does reflect an increase in real output, but it also reflects an increase in the prices of pizzas. So what we want to do is convert that to real dollars. And put that in red. Real dollars, GDP. So in other words, we want to adjust for inflation. Well, what we do is in 2012, when prices go up, if we want to put that in the same terms as 2011, we use the 2011 prices. So we take the 2012 pizzas, but multiply that by the 2011 prices. So in real terms, we get 1,500 times 10, which is $15,000. Okay, now we can compare it to 2011 because the prices are the same. We'll do that for each year. 2013, there's 1,350 pizzas, but we'll do that, we'll multiply that by $10, the prices in 2011, and we get 13,500. And in 2014, we have 2,000 pizzas. We'll multiply that by 2011 prices, and then we get $20,000. So what we have is this column is prices in terms of, or GDP, but in terms of 2011 prices. So what we call this is constant. This is constant 2011 dollars. And that is known as the base year. 2011, where the base year is 2011. Now in 2011, the numbers are output of 1,000 pizzas times the price of $10. So in real terms, in 2011 dollars, it is still $10,000. This way we can compare all the GDPs in the 4 years and see how it's really going up after we adjust for inflation. Now notice also here that in 2011, the nominal GDP is equal to the real GDP. So in the base year, the real GDP equals nominal GDP because we're using the same prices for both of them. Now the year 2011 was just picked arbitrarily by me. And that's how the base year really is picked. It's just arbitrary, an arbitrary year to use. We could have used 2012 prices. So let's do over here, we'll say, I'll do this in blue, real dollars, but we'll use 2012 prices. So 2012 prices is $11 for a pizza. So let's see. In 2011 we had 1,000 pizzas, but we'll multiply that 1,000 here by $11 and get $11,000. And in 2012, 1,500 times $11, it's going to be 16,500. And 1,350 pizzas, we'll multiply that by $11. That comes out to be 14,850. And then in 2014, using 2012 prices, $11 times 2,000 is 22,000. So this GDP is using constant, is in constant dollars, constant 2012 dollars. So the base year then is 2012. And since the base year is 2012, that means that the real dollars in 2012 would be the same as the nominal dollars in 2012. So you can see that, first of all, the nominal dollars is completely unimportant, because that really reflects price changes more than anything else. The real dollars is what we want to know, but the absolute value of these real dollars is not important, because the absolute value of these real dollars only depends upon the base year. Whenever we choose another base year, the absolute value of the real dollars changes. So that's not important anyway. What we really want to know is the growth rate. We want to know the growth rate anyway. The growth rate. If we're going to compare countries, that absolute value is fine as long as we're using the same base year in both countries. But we want to be able to calculate a growth rate, if we're just looking at one country, of GDP. Okay, so this slide shows the current GDP, which is in nominal dollars, for 2011 to 2014. And the next column in red shows the GDP in real dollars in 2011 prices, which is constant 2011 dollars. And then the third column is in constant 2012 dollars, also real GDP. So the black column here is real GDP, the red column here is real GDP, and the blue column here is nominal GDP. So what we want to be able to do here is to be able to calculate the growth rate of GDP. So let's pick 2011 to 2012. We want to calculate, say, the growth rate from 2011 to 2012. Well, the way we would do that is just simply to take the GDP from the second year, we'll call year 2, subtract off the GDP from the first year, year 1, and divide that by the GDP in year 1. Very simplistic way to do it. It's for purposes of our class, it's a suitable way to do it. We're not worried about compounding, things like that. If we were actually calculating the growth rate exactly, we would use some sort of exponential function. Just like as if we were calculating interest rate, we would compute it infinitely compounding. But we're not doing that. We're doing this just a very simple way. What is the growth rate starting in year 1 and starting in year 2 and seeing what the difference is? So in real GDP, it would be, let's see, 16,500 minus 11,000 divided by 11,000 is 0.50, or a 50% growth rate. 50% growth rate. And we can see that because we went from 1,000 pizzas in 2011 to 1,500 pizzas in 2012. That's a 50% increase. Now we could have just as easily used the red dollars, the constant 2011 dollars, to calculate it. 15,000 minus 10,000 divided by 10,000, which would still be 0.5 or 50%. So it wouldn't make any difference which year in real dollars we're using. Doesn't matter which baseline year we choose. The growth rate is still going to be the same. And if we were to compare that with the nominal growth rate for those 2 years, well, we would have, in nominal terms, let's see, it would be 16,500 minus 10,000 divided by 10,000, which I calculate to be 0.65 or 65% growth rate. And that's because we're including the increase in prices in there, which we don't want to do. Okay, notice here that if the base year is 2011, then in 2011 the current dollars will be equal to the constant dollars. So the nominal is going to be equal to the real in 2011. And if we use 2012 as the base year, then the nominal dollars is also going to be equal to the real dollars in that year. If we wanted to include pizza ovens in this example, no problem. When we're calculating these numbers, we would just add in the quantity of pizza ovens and multiply that by the price of the pizza ovens in each year, and just add that to the nominal GDP that's there to get the nominal GDP for that year. And then when calculating the real GDP, we would do it exactly the same way. We'd just use the quantities in 2012, say for example, and multiply that by the prices in 2011 or 2010 of pizza ovens to get the real amount for pizza ovens, and then just add that to the existing GDP that's there. So no problem, just in the exact same way we added up apples and oranges earlier, we would do the same thing here, just add up pizzas and pizza ovens. This graph here is the GDP for Venezuela from 2000 to 2010 as measured in its currency. And you can see on here that the orange line is the nominal GDP, and you can see it's going up at a pretty good clip throughout 2010. But once you adjust that for the increase in prices, we get the real GDP down on the lower line, which is in the blue line. And you can see that the blue line isn't going up much at all. It's pretty much flat for 10 years. Showing that this increase in GDP, if we only looked at nominal GDP, doesn't really give us a full picture, because GDP isn't going up at all. It's only going up in the nominal GDP, so it's more of a reflection of prices. And once we correct for those increases in prices, we see that real GDP really hasn't changed much at all in 10 years. If the currency on the vertical axis was measured as in logarithmic numbers, then the slope of those lines would give the GDP number, and the steeper the slope of those GDP numbers, then the bigger the increase in GDP, if that was a logarithmic function, which it isn't. Now GDP, real GDP, tells us how big the pie is, but it doesn't tell us how big the slices of pie are. Now think of it this way, say there's two countries, they're identical in every way, they both produce the same amount, but one has a lot more people in it than the other one. Well, there's the same amount of output, but divided up by a lot more people, so they're really a lot poorer for the same amount of output with more people. So economists like to look at per capita GDP. Per capita GDP. And this is real GDP divided by the number of people in the country. And this will give a much better measure of the well-being of the people in the country. We want GDP to go up. If GDP is going up, real GDP is going up, it means the economy is expanding. We don't want GDP to go down. If it's dropping, then the economy is contracting. And if the economy is contracting, that is a recession. And the old definition of a recession, which is a drop in real GDP for 2 consecutive quarters. And it doesn't have to be much. Just a little tiny drop is enough. The current definition of a recession has changed. The National Bureau of Economic Research has a committee called the Business Cycle Dating Committee that decides when a recession has begun and when it's ended. So this is the Business Cycle Dating Committee. So they get together and look at the data and decide when the recession has begun and when the recession has ended. The definition of a recession that the Business Cycle Dating Committee uses is a significant decline in economic activity spread across the country, lasting more than a few months, normally visible in real GDP growth, real personal income, employment, industrial production, and sales. So that's their definition, very vague definition, just a significant decline. Who knows what a significant decline is? Lasting more than a few months. So that's the current definition of a recession. I prefer the old definition of a recession that is more objective, of just 2 consecutive quarters, a quarter being 3 months, of GDP that's dropped. But you can choose which one you want to use yourself. Okay, if the economy is at full employment, we should be out here somewhere on the PPF. Yet this would be potential GDP, potential output, or GDP. If we are inside the PPF, that means that there are idle resources, such as unemployment, and this would be a cyclical unemployment because of a downturn in the economy. And any change in GDP is going to be reflected here. So a drop in GDP is going to be moving this way. An increase in GDP is going to be moving that way. The potential should be shifting out over time in this direction. We may be inside the PPF because of recession. And even though we start to grow and the economy is growing, not in recession anymore, we still may be in the PPF or inside this PPF for a little while until we can get back out on the curve or even catch up with potential GDP.